A simple visit to the courthouse takes a shocking turn when a black woman is aggressively confronted by security, mistaken for someone who doesn't belong. But when the truth is revealed, the entire room is left speechless. What happens when those who judge too quickly find themselves being judged? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The courthouse lobby was alive with the morning rush. Lawyers in tailored suits, clerks balancing stacks of files, defendants shifting nervously on wooden benches. Jordan Carter walked through the grand marble entrance with a steady, unassuming stride, her sensible heels clicking against the polished floor. She had done this hundreds of times before, but today she wasn't wearing her robe. No courtroom, no bailiff, no official introduction to announce her authority. Today she was just Jordan. She had arrived early, hoping to review some last-minute case notes in peace before the morning docket began. Carrying only her leather briefcase, she maneuvered through the crowd, nodding politely at the few familiar faces she recognized. But to the majority of the people in the courthouse, including security, she was just another black woman in professional attire. The moment she stepped past the metal detectors, she felt the eyes on her. She had seen it before. Cautious glances, unnecessary scrutiny, the subtle tightening of grips on walkie-talkies. One particular officer, a tall, broad-shouldered white man with a buzz cut, locked his gaze onto her like a predator eyeing unfamiliar prey. She ignored it at first, walking with the same confidence she always carried, but the sound of hurried footsteps behind her made her stomach tighten. "Ma'am?" His voice boomed across the lobby, turning a few heads. Jordan stopped, but didn't turn immediately. She inhaled slowly, schooling her expression before facing him. "Yes?" she asked, calm, professional. The officer squared his shoulders, resting his hand on the baton at his hip. "You lost?" Jordan blinked. "Excuse me? You looking for someone? You can't just wander around in here." The ridiculousness of the question made her lips part slightly. She knew exactly where she was. She had spent more hours inside these walls than this man probably had, but there was something about blackness that made people assume you didn't belong. "I'm not lost," she said evenly. "I know exactly where I'm going." "Yay? And where's that?" His tone was sharper now, demanding an explanation that he never would have asked of the young white law clerk that had just breezed by without a second glance. Jordan raised an eyebrow. She could have shut this down in an instant, could have simply stated her position and watched him backpedal, but something in her told her to wait, to let him keep digging this hole for himself. "I don't believe I need to explain my movements in a public building," she said, her voice measured. The security guard's jaw tightened. "Listen, lady, we get a lot of people wandering in here who have no business being in these halls. You need to check in with the front desk, or I'll have to escort you out." Several people were watching now. Whispers, small murmurs. Jordan took a slow breath, steadying herself. "And what exactly gives you the impression that I don't belong here?" The guard gave a humorless chuckle. "I don't have time for this. Show me some ID, or I'll have to call someone down here to handle it." Jordan tilted her head slightly. This was the part she always found fascinating, the casual audacity, the way they spoke as if their authority was absolute, as if she didn't have the power to shatter that illusion with a single sentence. She reached into her briefcase, her movements deliberate, and pulled out a small leather case. Without breaking eye contact, she flipped it open, revealing her official courthouse identification. The guard leaned in, his frown deepening, and then his face drained of color. "On Jordan Carter, Superior Court Judge." The air between them thickened. He swallowed hard, the weight of his own mistake settling onto his shoulders as the reality of who he had just interrogated crashed down on him. The people around them had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold with quiet anticipation. Jordan didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. The guard licked his lips, looking between her ID and her face as if hoping this was some elaborate prank. "Judge Carter," he finally muttered, his voice weaker now. Jordan snapped the case shut. "I see you finally figured that out." There was no need to say more. The silence that followed was its own form of justice. The weight of his assumption hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The same security guard who had so confidently tried to remove her from the courthouse was now scrambling for the right words. I was just doing your job," Jordan finished for him. The man exhaled through his nose, clearly debating whether to try salvaging what was left of his dignity. Jordan stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Do yourself a favor and ask yourself why you assumed I wasn't supposed to be here. Because I promise you, if I had been a white man in a suit, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The guard swallowed hard, his gaze dropping. Jordan let the silence linger before finally stepping past him. She didn't look back, didn't give him another glance. She simply walked toward the courtroom where she would be presiding over today's cases. Cases that might even involve officers like him. And as the heavy wooden doors shut behind her, the security guard stood frozen in place, still trying to process how the same woman he had just tried to remove was about to sit behind the bench. The murmurs hadn't stopped. Even as Jordan sat at the bench, her gavel resting in front of her, she could feel the energy shift in the courtroom. She didn't need to look up to know that people were still whispering about what had just happened in the lobby. The security guard, whose nameplate had read H. Keller, was probably still standing there, stunned, humiliated, and regretting his life choices. But that wasn't her concern. She adjusted her glasses and flipped open her docket for the morning cases. The first was a routine misdemeanor, a public intoxication charge that would likely be dismissed with a fine. The second, a landlord-tenant dispute that had been dragging on for months. And then there was the third case, the one she had already suspected would give her the most trouble today. A workplace discrimination lawsuit against a private security firm. Jordan barely reacted as she read over the names of the involved parties. But there it was, clear as day. Defendant, Keystone Security Services. The very same company that had stationed its officers in this courthouse, including the one who had just tried to remove her from it. She had read about this case in her pre-trial notes. A former black employee, fired under questionable circumstances, had accused the company of racial bias in its hiring and disciplinary practices. The plaintiff, Andre Wilks, had worked for Keystone for nearly 5 years before he was abruptly terminated. According to the case file, he had been let go for failure to follow protocol after an altercation with a fellow officer, a white officer who, based on internal reports, had been the aggressor in the situation. The company, however, had chosen to fire Andre and retain the other officer. Now, Andre was fighting back, and his lawyer had built a strong case around years of documented patterns of unfair treatment toward black employees. Jordan exhaled slowly. The irony was almost poetic. A soft knock at the chamber door signaled her bailiff, a stern but fair woman named Maria, who had been working alongside Jordan since she was first appointed to the bench. "Ready, Judge Carter?" Maria asked, stepping into the room with her usual no-nonsense demeanor. Jordan nodded. "Let's get started." She stood, adjusted her robe, and followed Maria into the courtroom. As soon as she entered, the entire room rose to their feet. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "Superior Court of the State of Illinois, Judge Jordan Carter presiding." Jordan took her seat at the bench, scanning the room before finally speaking. "You may be seated." There was a shuffling of movement as people returned to their seats. Her eyes swept over the attorneys, the plaintiff, the defendant, and, of course, the small group of Keystone security officers sitting stiffly at the back of the courtroom. Jordan didn't allow her gaze to linger on them, but she knew one of those officers was watching her more closely than the rest. She already knew who. H. Keller sat near the back, arms crossed, face tight, his badge still gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was the same expression she had seen on men like him before, the look of someone whose entire perception of the world had been shaken in a single moment. She wondered if he had put it together yet. Did he realize that his company was now standing trial before her, that the same woman he had tried to forcibly remove from this courthouse now had the power to decide the fate of the people who signed his paycheck? If he hadn't, he would soon. The plaintiff's attorney, a sharp black woman named Camille Benton, stood to make her opening argument. She wasted no time laying out the facts of the case. Your Honor, we are here today because my client, Mr. Andre Wilks, was unlawfully terminated from Keystone Security Services in what is clearly a pattern of racial discrimination, Camille began. Mr. Wilks was not fired for incompetence. He was not fired for endangering anyone. He was fired because he stood up for himself against unfair treatment, and his employer, rather than addressing the systemic problem within their organization, chose to eliminate him instead. Jordan listened carefully, watching Camille's movements. She was good, confident, passionate, but controlled. The defense lawyer, a middle-aged white man with salt and pepper hair named Brian Denning, remained seated, flipping through his notes as if unbothered. When it was his turn to speak, he stood with an air of practiced indifference. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that Mr. Wilks was employed by Keystone Security for several years, we reject the assertion that his termination was in any way racially motivated. The plaintiff failed to adhere to company policy, and as a security firm, our primary concern is the safety and discipline of our employees. Mr. Wilks engaged in an altercation with another officer, which by our policies warranted termination. Jordan remained expressionless as she listened. She knew the tactic: frame the black man as aggressive, reduce the issue to failure to follow protocol, so they wouldn't have to acknowledge the deeper racial bias that had led to the discrepancy in disciplinary action. But Camille wasn't letting them get away with that. Your Honor, she said smoothly, standing again, we have documented proof that white officers at Keystone Security have engaged in similar, and in some cases far worse, altercations, and yet retained their employment. Furthermore, there is evidence that Mr. Wilks was passed over for promotions multiple times, despite glowing performance reviews. She walked to the plaintiff's table, placing a stack of documents in front of her. We have internal emails showing that decisions regarding disciplinary actions were influenced by racial bias, and we have testimony from other former employees who can attest to a pattern of discrimination against black security officers within Keystone's ranks. Jordan turned her gaze to Brian Denning. He was still trying to keep his face neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He hadn't expected Camille to come this prepared. She looked down at the case file again, reading over the details. Then she glanced at the list of names in the defense's witness list. One name stood out immediately: H. Keller. Her lips pressed together slightly. The same security officer who had questioned her mere moments ago was now listed as one of Keystone's character witnesses. The irony was now more than poetic, it was almost laughable. She turned back to the room, glancing at Keller, who was still watching the proceedings with a tight expression. He hadn't spoken a word, but she knew he was thinking, processing, trying to figure out how he had ended up in this situation. Jordan kept her voice steady. Thank you, counselors. I've heard your arguments, and we will proceed with witness testimonies. Plaintiff may call their first witness. Camille nodded and called Andre Wilks to the stand. As Andre stood and walked toward the witness box, Jordan caught one last glimpse of Keller. His face was unreadable now, but his hands were gripping his arms tightly. Maybe, for the first time, he was beginning to understand what it felt like to be judged unfairly. Andre Wilks took his oath, settled into the witness stand, and adjusted his tie. His fingers flexed on the wood as he gathered his composure, eyes flicking between the attorneys, the jury, and Jordan herself. He was a man who had been through the system before, who had learned the art of measured patience in the face of adversity. Camille Benton approached him, her heels clicking confidently against the polished floor. She stopped just short of the witness stand, giving him a moment to breathe before beginning. Mr. Wilks, let's start from the beginning. How long did you work for Keystone Security? 5 years. And in those 5 years, how many times were you disciplined for any misconduct before the incident in question? Andre sat up a little straighter. None. Camille turned to the jury, letting that statement hang in the air. No disciplinary actions, no warnings, no violations of company policy. And yet, after one single incident, an altercation in which you were not the aggressor, you were terminated? Yes, ma'am. Jordan glanced at the defense table. Brian Denning shifted slightly, his jaw tight. He could see where this was going, but he wasn't ready to intervene just yet. Camille continued. Let's talk about that altercation. Can you describe exactly what happened that day? Andre inhaled deeply, his gaze steady. I was on my usual patrol. Everything was normal until I heard shouting from the east corridor. When I got there, I saw Officer Reynolds, one of my co-workers, pinning a young black man against the wall. The kid looked terrified, and Reynolds was gripping his arm hard, yelling at him to stay put. Camille nodded. Did you know the young man? No, but I knew that Reynolds had a history of using unnecessary force, especially against black civilians. He had been reported multiple times before, but nothing ever came of it. I stepped in and told him to ease up, to wait for backup if he really thought the kid was a threat. And how did Officer Reynolds respond? Andre clenched his jaw. He got in my face, told me to mind my business. I told him the kid wasn't resisting and that he didn't need to use that much force. We exchanged words, and then he shoved me. Hard. Jordan watched the jury. Some leaned forward, others scribbled notes. They were engaged, but what she was most interested in was the reaction of the defense. Brian Denning hadn't objected yet. He was waiting. Calculate. Camille pressed on. Did you retaliate? No. Did you shove him back, threaten him? And yet you were the one fired. Andre exhaled sharply. Yes, ma'am. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Camille walked back to her table, picking up a folder before turning toward the jury again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to submit these internal reports into evidence. These documents show multiple complaints against Officer Reynolds. Reports of excessive force, discriminatory behavior, and aggression towards black civilians. None of these resulted in disciplinary action. However, the one officer who tried to de-escalate a situation was terminated within a week of the incident. She let the words sink in before continuing. Mr. Wilks, before you were fired, were you ever considered for a promotion? Andre's face darkened. 3 times. And what happened? I was always passed over, even though I had more experience than the guys who got promoted, even though I trained some of them myself. I was told I wasn't quite leadership material. Leadership material? Camille repeated, raising an eyebrow. And who were the officers that were promoted instead? Andre hesitated. White officers. Every time. Jordan scanned the faces of the jurors. Some were nodding subtly. Others were watching Denning, waiting for his rebuttal. Camille turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Jordan looked at Denning. Defense? He stood, buttoning his jacket, taking a breath before approaching. Mr. Wilks, he began, adopting a casual tone. You say you were not the aggressor in this altercation, but security footage shows you standing toe-to-toe with Officer Reynolds. Isn't that correct? Andre didn't flinch. Yes, because I was trying to get him to de-escalate. But you didn't call for backup, did you? I didn't have time. Reynolds was already escalating the situation. Denning nodded as if considering this. But the fact remains the company has policies for these situations. Instead of reporting Reynolds afterward, you engaged in a direct confrontation with him. Isn't that why the company let you go? Andre exhaled. I was let go because I was a black man challenging a white officer. Denning's mouth twitched. That's speculation, Mr. Wilks. It's the truth. Jordan saw it then. The shift. Denning had hoped to poke holes in Andre's case, but the confidence in his voice, the consistency of his testimony was unshakable. The more Denning pressed, the worse it made Keystone Security look. The lawyer cleared his throat. No further questions, Your Honor. Jordan nodded, turning to Andre. You may step down. Andre rose, adjusting his suit as he returned to his seat. His shoulders were squared, his expression calm. He had said what needed to be said. The defense called their first witness. H. Keller. Jordan kept her expression neutral as the same officer who had confronted her earlier now took the stand. He sat stiffly, fingers clasped together. His name echoed through the room as he was sworn in. Denning approached him. "Officer Keller, how long have you worked for Keystone?" 8 years. "And in your experience, does Keystone operate with fairness and professionalism?" Keller hesitated for just a second, a barely perceptible pause. "Yes." Denning nodded. "And in your time there, have you ever witnessed any racial bias in hiring or disciplinary actions?" Another pause. Jordan caught it. So did the jury. "No," Keller finally said, but his voice wasn't as firm. Denning continued his line of questioning, but the hesitation had already done its damage. Keller answered stiffly, offering half-hearted defenses of the company's policies. Then it was Camille's turn. She approached him slowly, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "Officer Keller, how many black officers currently hold leadership positions at Keystone?" Keller's throat bobbed. Take your time," Camille said smoothly. He blinked. "I don't know the exact number." Camille cocked her head. "Try." Keller exhaled sharply. "None, to my knowledge." Silence. Camille let it linger. "That's interesting." Denning sat up straighter, ready to object, but Camille moved on. "Tell me, Officer Keller, have you ever made an assumption about someone based on the way they look?" Keller stiffened. Jordan watched as he struggled, his gaze flickering briefly toward her. He knew. Everyone in the room knew. Keller's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The courtroom was silent. And for the first time, the man who had questioned Jordan's right to be in this courthouse finally understood what it felt like to be on the other side of judgment. The courtroom held its breath. Keller's silence stretched long enough for the tension to become unbearable. He shifted in his seat, his lips pressing together as he wrestled with the weight of his own conscience. Jordan could see it, the internal battle of a man who had spent years confident in his beliefs, now forced to examine them under the unforgiving light of truth. Camille stepped closer, her voice softer now. "Officer Keller, you didn't answer my question. Have you ever made an assumption about someone based on the way they look?" Keller swallowed. His gaze flickered to Jordan for the briefest of moments before he exhaled through his nose. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Camille didn't press. She didn't need to. The confession had already done its work. "No further questions, Your Honor," she said, stepping away. Denning hesitated before standing. He looked at Keller like he wanted to salvage the situation, but there was nothing left to save. Instead, he simply said, "No further questions." Jordan nodded once. "You may step down, Officer Keller." Keller stood stiffly, making his way back to the defense table. He didn't look at Denning. He didn't look at anyone. He just sat, hands clasped together, staring down at the desk in front of him. The case proceeded with final arguments. Camille delivered hers with precision, laying out the undeniable evidence of racial bias within Keystone Security. She didn't need theatrics, the facts were damning enough. "Keystone Security wants you to believe this was about protocol," she said, her voice steady. "They want you to believe that my client was fired for not following the rules. But what they won't tell you, what they can't explain, is why those same rules didn't apply to Officer Reynolds. Why is it that when a black officer tries to uphold justice, he is punished, but when a white officer abuses his power, he is protected? That, ladies and gentlemen, is discrimination, and discrimination has no place in our courts, our businesses, or our society." Denning tried to counter, but his words were hollow. He attempted to reframe the argument as a simple employment dispute, but the damage had been done. The jury deliberated for hours. Jordan waited patiently in her chambers, sipping her tea, reviewing files, keeping her mind occupied. She had learned long ago that once a case was in the hands of the jury, there was no use in dwelling on what might happen. When the bailiff knocked, signaling that a verdict had been reached, Jordan calmly adjusted her robe and walked back into the courtroom. "I'll rise," Maria announced, as Jordan took her seat at the bench. She scanned the faces in the room. The plaintiff's table was tense, but hopeful. The defense was rigid, their confidence eroded. Keller was still sitting in the back, a man who looked like he was waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. Jordan nodded toward the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, an older black woman with kind but unyielding eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Jordan gestured for her to proceed. "In the matter of Wilks versus Keystone Security, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff." A collective exhale swept through the room. Camille squeezed Andre's arm as he let out a breath he had been holding for far too long. Jordan's expression remained neutral, professional, as she turned to the defense table. "The jury has ruled in favor of Mr. Wilks. Keystone Security is ordered to compensate the plaintiff for lost wages, damages, and legal fees. Additionally, the court recommends a full independent review of Keystone's employment practices." Denning's jaw clenched, but he nodded. There was nothing left to fight. Jordan turned to Andre. "Mr. Wilks, I hope this verdict brings you some measure of justice." Andre met her gaze, his voice steady but emotional. "Thank you, Your Honor." Jordan gave a single nod before lifting her gavel. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck. The courtroom erupted into quiet murmurs as people began to gather their things. Camille hugged Andre, whispering something to him before turning to shake hands with her team. Denning was already packing up his files, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Jordan stood and walked toward the exit, but as she did, she caught sight of Keller. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the floor, his hands still clasped together. He looked smaller than before, like a man who had lost something he didn't even know he had been holding on to. She could have walked past him, could have left him to sit in his silence. But something made her stop. She turned slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "I hope you learned something today, Officer Keller." His head lifted. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something different now, something less certain. Jordan didn't wait for an answer. She had a feeling she'd already gotten it. She walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind the echoes of justice that had finally been served.